The divorce papers were served on a Tuesday morning inside the house Imogen had helped pay for, in the living room where she had once hung Christmas lights, while her husband stood below, holding the ladder and laughing at something she said. That detail came back to her later. The laughing, the ladder, the way he had looked up at her like she was something worth steadying for. By the time Clifton Ashworth Vale, 41, co-chair of Ashworth Family Holdings, and the man Imogen had been married to for 9 years, slid the envelope across the kitchen island, he was not laughing. He was standing very straight, wearing the charcoal suit he saved for board presentations, and beside him stood Renata. No, that name was taken. Beside him stood a woman named Suzanne, 34, who worked in commercial real estate and who had been present at 3 of the last 4 Ashworth family dinners as a colleague. Imogen Ashworth Vale, née Bryce Corwin, 38 years old, former senior analyst at Viridian Capital Partners, and the woman who had quietly spent the last 4 years restructuring what was left of her own family's investment trust, picked up the envelope. She did not open it right away. She set it on the counter next to her coffee and looked at it the way she looked at a term sheet she already knew was unfavorable. "My mother thinks it's time," Clifton said. That was the sentence he led with. Not "I've been unhappy" or "I fell in love with someone else" or even "I'm sorry, Imogen." His mother thought it was time, as though a 9-year marriage was a lease that had come up for renewal, and Margaret Ashworth, 68, matriarch of the Ashworth family, and the woman who had referred to Imogen as Clifton's wife for 9 consecutive years rather than by her name, had simply decided not to renew. Imogen took a sip of her coffee. It had gone cold. "Okay," she said. Clifton looked surprised. He had prepared for something. She could see it in the way his posture adjusted, the way his jaw shifted slightly as though recalibrating. He had braced for tears or for anger, or at minimum for a question. She gave him none of those things. She picked up the envelope and walked down the hall to the small office she kept off the master bedroom, and she closed the door behind her. She sat at her desk for a long time without turning on the lamp. The Ashworth family had been in commercial real estate and private holdings for 3 generations. Clifton's grandfather, a man everyone called Old Ash, had built the first office complex in Burlington in 1961. By the time Margaret's husband, Clifton's father, Edward Ashworth, who died of a stroke in 2019, had handed the reins to Clifton, Ashworth Family Holdings controlled 7 commercial properties across southern Ontario and had a reputation for being old money stable, moderately profitable, and deeply conservative in every decision they made. What they were not, by the time Imogen quietly began paying attention, was financially healthy. She had noticed it first in 2021, at a dinner where Clifton had more wine than usual and said something offhand about the Regent Street property underperforming again. She had asked a follow-up question. He had changed the subject. She had let it go, but she had not forgotten it, because Imogen Bryce Corwin had grown up in a household where financial instability was something you learned to smell from 3 rooms away. And she had been smelling something off in the Ashworth finances for longer than she had let on. Her own family had lost nearly everything when she was 19. Her father, a man named Douglas Corwin, who had trusted the wrong partners and signed the wrong documents, had watched a regional logistics company he had spent 20 years building get dismantled by debt and mismanagement. Imogen had been in her 2nd year of commerce at Queen's when it happened. She had finished her degree anyway. She had gone into finance anyway. She had spent the 15 years after that learning, very carefully and very quietly, exactly how money moved and where it hid and what it looked like when it was about to disappear. By 2022, she knew that Ashworth Family Holdings was in serious trouble. The Regent Street property was the visible problem. The real problem was the debt load they had taken on to refinance 2 other properties during the pandemic, at variable rates, from a lender who had since been absorbed into a larger institution that was far less patient with delinquent accounts. There was also the matter of a development deal in Hamilton that had stalled for 18 months due to zoning complications that anyone with a proper legal review would have caught before signing. Clifton knew some of this. Margaret knew less. Neither of them had asked Imogen. They never asked Imogen. In 9 years of marriage, she had attended exactly 4 Ashworth Holdings board meetings, and at 3 of them she had been introduced as Clifton's wife, rather than as the woman who had spent a decade doing institutional investment analysis. At the 4th meeting, when she had offered a specific observation about the Hamilton zoning issue, Margaret had smiled and said that she would pass it along to their lawyer and had then moved on without writing anything down. Imogen had said nothing. She had driven home, sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, and then gone inside and started making dinner. What she had also done, beginning in late 2022 and continuing through the following year with the kind of methodical patience that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all, was begin assembling the pieces of something she had been thinking about for a long time. Her mother's side of the family, the Bryce side, had always been quieter money than the Corwins. A grandmother who had invested early in several mid-sized Canadian technology companies and then died before the family fully understood what she had left behind. A trust that had been mismanaged for a decade, and then, when Imogen finally had the legal standing and financial knowledge to do something about it, restructured under a numbered company she had registered in 2020 under the name Northgate Corwin Capital. Northgate Corwin Capital had no website. It had a registered address at a law firm on King Street West. It had, by the end of 2023, approximately $14 million in liquid assets and a mandate to acquire undervalued commercial real estate in secondary Ontario markets. Clifton did not know about Northgate Corwin Capital. He knew that Imogen had some money from her grandmother's side, and that she did some consulting work, and that she drove a sensible car and never asked him for anything expensive, which he seemed to interpret as evidence that she did not have expensive things. It did not occur to him to look more carefully, because in 9 years it had not occurred to him to look at Imogen very carefully at all. Margaret knew even less. Margaret had formed her opinion of Imogen sometime around 2016 and had not revisited it since. The offer on the Ashworth Regent Street property came through a broker in November of 2023. It was fair, not aggressive, not lowball, and it came with a clean acquisition structure and no conditions that would spook a family with something to prove. The acquiring entity was listed as NCK Property Group, a subsidiary of Northgate Corwin Capital. The Ashworth board accepted the offer in December. Clifton signed the documents on a Thursday. He told Imogen that evening that they had sold the Regent Street property to a Toronto-based investment group, and that the liquidity had given them some breathing room. He seemed relieved. He poured 2 glasses of wine and offered her one. She accepted it. She did not tell him who NCK Property Group was. She did not tell him who owned Northgate Corwin Capital. She sat with him in the kitchen of the house they shared, and she drank the wine. And she listened to him talk about what the Ashworth family might do with the financial runway this sale had given them. 3 weeks later, Northgate made a second offer. This one was for the Hamilton development project, which had stalled so thoroughly that the family's original development partner had already walked away. The offer covered the cost basis and a modest return, which under the circumstances was generous. The board accepted it within a week. By February of 2024, NCK Property Group had become the largest single outside acquirer of Ashworth Holdings assets in the company's history. Clifton still did not know. In March, when the third offer came, this one for the 2 legacy office properties in Oakville, which were the oldest and most emotionally significant assets in the Ashworth portfolio, Margaret had called a full family meeting to discuss it. Imogen had attended. She had sat at the long dining room table in the Ashworth family home in Ancaster, and she had listened to Margaret talk about the weight of selling property that old Ash had built with his own hands, and she had nodded at the appropriate moments, and she had not said a word. The board voted to accept the Oakville offer in April. On a Tuesday morning in May, 2 weeks after the Oakville transaction closed, Clifton placed a manila envelope on the kitchen island and told Imogen that his mother thought it was time. The separation agreement Clifton had prepared was tidy. His lawyer had been thorough. There was a division of shared assets, a buyout figure for Imogen's stake in the house, and a clause about spousal support that reflected the gap between his income and hers, or rather, the gap between his income and the income he believed she had. She read the agreement that evening in her office with the lamp on. She made notes in the margins. She took a photograph of each page with her phone. The next morning she called a lawyer of her own. Her lawyer, a woman named Abina Owusu-Darko, who operated out of a firm on Bay Street and who had an unhurried manner that concealed a very precise mind, reviewed the agreement and identified several issues within 48 hours. The most significant issue was the asset disclosure schedule, which listed Clifton's holdings accurately and Imogen's holdings in a way that suggested Clifton's legal team had relied entirely on the information Clifton had provided them, which was to say, the information Clifton had. "Is the disclosure on your side complete?" Abina asked. "It's not accurate," Imogen said. Abina looked at her for a moment. "How not accurate?" Imogen slid a document across the desk. It was a corporate disclosure summary for Northgate Corwin Capital, with subsidiaries listed. Abina read it without expression for approximately 30 seconds. Then she set it down and said, "I see, I'd like to handle this carefully," Imogen said. "I imagine you would," Abina said. The next board meeting of Ashworth Family Holdings was scheduled for the 3rd week of June. It was a routine quarterly review, or it had been designed to be routine, before Clifton's divorce proceedings introduced certain complications to the question of what routine meant anymore. Imogen was not on the Ashworth board. She had never been invited onto the Ashworth board. She arrived at the board meeting anyway. She arrived because she had been notified through the proper channels as a representative of NCK Property Group, which held acquired interests in 3 former Ashworth assets and had a pending proposal regarding the remaining portfolio structure. The notification had gone to the board secretary 6 days prior, in accordance with the terms of the acquisition agreements. The board secretary, who had been with the Ashworths for 11 years and who handled the administrative details of board business with careful professionalism, had processed the notification and added the item to the agenda without flagging it to Clifton personally, because that was not how the process worked. Clifton was already seated when Imogen walked in. She watched his face move through several things at once. Confusion first. What was she doing here? Then a kind of embarrassed rearrangement, the face a person makes when 2 parts of their life that are meant to remain separate have collided in front of witnesses. Then, as she settled into the chair across from him and placed her folder on the table, something harder and more defensive. "Imogen," he said. The way he said it landed like a question and an accusation at the same time. Margaret, 68, who was seated at the head of the table and who had been looking at the agenda with a slight frown, looked up. Her expression when she saw Imogen was the particular expression of a woman who had made decisions about someone and found those decisions being complicated. "By what authority are you here?" Margaret said. She did not say it rudely exactly. She said it the way someone says something when they are accustomed to their authority going unchallenged. Imogen opened her folder. She slid a single document down the table toward Margaret. "NCK Property Group. I'm here representing the acquiring entity on the items listed in points 4 through 7 of today's agenda." Margaret looked at the document. She looked at it for long enough that the silence in the room became its own kind of statement. "NCK Property Group," Clifton said slowly, "is a subsidiary of Northgate Corwin Capital," Imogen said. "And Northgate Corwin Capital is mine," Imogen said, just the one word. The room held that word for a moment. The board's other members, Clifton's cousin Piers, the family's longtime financial advisor Bernard Holt, and an independent director named Claudette Forsyth, who had joined the board 2 years ago, did not say anything. Bernard Holt was looking at his own copy of the agenda with the expression of a man who had perhaps suspected something and was now watching his suspicion become fact. Claudette Forsyth, for her part, appeared to be doing the mental arithmetic quite quickly. She had a background in mergers and acquisitions. Imogen had researched her before this meeting. "You acquired the Regent Street property," Clifton said. It was not a question by the time he finished it, and the Hamilton project, and the Oakville portfolio. He was very still. "You knew about the debt. I've known about the debt for 2 years. Why didn't you?" He stopped. He seemed to understand, somewhere in the middle of the sentence, why she hadn't. "Why didn't you say anything?" Imogen looked at him. Not unkindly, not with triumph either, exactly. With something more like the expression of a woman who has spent 9 years watching a door that was never going to open. "I tried," she said. "At the Hamilton meeting in 2022, your mother moved on without writing it down." Margaret did not respond to this. She had set the document on the table in front of her, and she was looking at it rather than at Imogen, which was itself a kind of answer. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes. Imogen presented the NCK Property Group proposal, which was thorough and clearly prepared, and which offered the Ashworth board a structured path forward, a partial buyback option on 2 of the 3 acquired assets at favorable terms, contingent on a proper governance restructure, and the appointment of an independent financial oversight committee. The terms were not punitive. They were, if anything, more generous than the board had any right to expect. Bernard Holt said so, quietly toward the end. Clifton said almost nothing for the last 40 minutes of the meeting. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. Once he looked at Imogen with an expression she couldn't quite read. It might have been anger, or it might have been something sadder than anger. The look of a man realizing that he had never actually known the person sitting across from him, not because she had hidden herself from him, but because he had never looked. After the meeting, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Margaret stopped Imogen. "How long have you been planning this?" Margaret asked. Her voice was very controlled. Imogen considered the question honestly. "I wasn't planning it," she said. "I was protecting something. What I needed protecting from changed over time." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. The expression on her face was complicated in a way that faces rarely are when people have made their minds up about someone as fully as Margaret had made hers up about Imogen. "Clifton's father would have liked you," Margaret said finally. It didn't sound like a compliment, exactly. It didn't sound like the opposite either. Imogen thanked her and went to get her coat. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. The asset disclosure process, once Northgate Corwin Capital was properly documented, shifted the settlement terms considerably. Not dramatically. Imogen had not structured any of this to devastate anyone. She had structured it the way she structured everything, carefully, with clean documentation, and with the understanding that what you build should be able to stand on its own. She moved into a condominium in Westdale. It was smaller than the house had been, but it had good light in the morning, and a second bedroom she converted into an office with a better desk than the one she'd had in the hall off the master. The Ashworth Holdings board restructured itself over the following year. Claudette Forsyth became chair. Bernard Holt, who turned out to be more adaptable than the situation had required him to be until now, managed the transition competently. The two Oakville properties stayed under NCK management. The Hamilton project broke ground in the autumn. Clifton and Suzanne moved to a house in Dundas. Imogen heard about this not from anyone who told her directly, but from the ambient information that collects in small ways when you've been part of a family, even imperfectly, for nearly a decade. She did not think about this very often. What she thought about. On the mornings when she stood in the kitchen of the Westdale condo, with better coffee than she'd ever made in the Ancaster house, was the image of her father sitting at the kitchen table. The week the company went into receivership, looking at documents he could not change, because the decisions had already been made. She had been 19 then. She had not known how to help him. She had spent the next 20 years learning how to help herself instead, and the instrument she had built was not a weapon. It was not a punishment. It was just what it was. A trust that predated the marriage. A numbered company with clean documentation. A set of acquisition agreements signed by people who had never thought to ask whose name was behind the subsidiary. Her name was behind the subsidiary. It had always been her name. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to say so. The name on the Hamilton development when the signage went up in late autumn read Northgate Corwin Capital, NCK Property Group. It was not the Ashworth name. It was not her married name either. It was the name she had given it herself, before any of this began, on a Thursday afternoon at a law firm on King Street West, in a city where no one who knew her as Clifton's wife was watching. She had known even then that it might matter someday. She just hadn't known which Tuesday the envelope would land on.